Welcome to Retired Coast Podcast. We're not starting with the typical intro now. This is a very special episode that I wanted to make sure that people would listen to and appreciate as much as I do. I was doing some research on our 250th anniversary of the United States founding, basically the Declaration of Independence. That'll take place July 2026. And during that investigation, I found that there was hardly any discussion about women. And I'd understood this reading something years ago, that women were very important. I was astounded by what I found, and I think you also will be, that our women, I'm saying that because my relatives fought in the Revolutionary War. They came to the United States in the early 1700s and lived in the Philadelphia area. And we have records showing that they fought in that war. And I'm sure that the women, my distant relatives and many of yours distant relatives, were also there with their husbands, and they followed the camps around. But their contributions were indispensable. We would not have won that war had it not been for what these women did. Now, we've done an article about the camp followers, which is also very enlightening, but we wanted to put a spotlight on several women that have been called out for their special bravery and their help during the Revolutionary War. Some of them were awarded later on. The problem, I think, in general, is that the women's contribution to winning the Revolutionary War was completely understated. It's not taught in school. It wasn't taught when I was in grammar school or high school or college, and I wanted you to know it. It's a very, very sensitive thing for me. I don't know why, other than it's just terrific. The other part of it is that my mother was working in a tank factory during World War II, and I more or less tied the two together. And then I thought back about the Civil War and about World War I and the nurses and all the women that came right to the battlefield that are just completely ignored pretty much in history. So please listen to this dialogue that comes up, and it's going to give you everything based on a lot of facts and research, but it'll be an interesting way for you to learn what I learned, and I think that you'll be as impressed as I was. So please go to the retiredcoast.com website to read the article of this name, and you'll see lots of pictures and some things you can download. I'm impressed. I think you will be too if you go and take a look at our article there and read more of our articles on the 260th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Thank you for coming.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking just a monumental stack of historical sources. We're talking affidavits, pension claims, court documents, and we're going to use them to completely flip the narrative on one of the most foundational moments in American history.
The Revolutionary War.
Exactly.
And that's really our mission here. When most of us, visualize 1776, we see the same images. It's George Washington, it's the ragged Continentals.
The fighting man, always the fighting man.
Always. And our goal today is to move beyond that very narrow, male-centered narrative and focus really intensively on the unsung heroes.
Specifically, the thousands of women who, as these documents show, absolutely sustained the fight for independence. So, okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at sources that are trying to correct a historical imbalance that's, centuries old?
Oh, at least. And we're diving headfirst into the world of the camp followers, which is a term.
A term I've always found a little dismissive.
It's incredibly dismissive. And as we're going to see, it minimizes and just diminishes the brutal, essential work these women were doing under, just extraordinary pressure.
And the key to this deep dive, is that we're not just relying on folklore or vague stories passed down.
No, not at all. We are drawing from forensic historical research. This is work that analyzes really rare records, things like pension files that were filed decades after the war ended.
Okay, so these are women in their old age trying to get some kind of recognition or support.
Exactly. Sworn testimony is given under oath in a court of law, regimental declarations. These documents are the the bureaucratic paper trail of survival, and they reveal truths that have been hidden for a long time under layers of myth and, frankly, cultural prejudice.
So it feels like that traditional image, the soldier with the musket, it's genuinely only half the story. And maybe the most dramatic half, but still just half.
Precisely. The other half involves thousands of individuals, women, children, laborers, who literally marched beside the army day in and day out.
They weren't just standing on the sidelines watching a parade go by.
No, they were the logistical engine. They were the quartermaster corps, the medical staff, the cooks, all bundled into one informal, unpaid, and almost entirely unacknowledged group.
So our task today is to use these specific records to really shatter the myths about just how significant women's roles were in winning the war.
That's the mission.
All right, let's get into it.
Okay.
So let's start with just the sheer necessity of it all. This idea of women following the army, it sounds so informal, but our sources are showing this wasn't some strange American thing.
No, not at all. It was a deeply ingrained military tradition, inherited directly from European and colonial practice. It was a global military reality, really.
It was driven purely by necessity.
100%. Armies needed to eat, they needed their clothes washed to prevent disease, they needed basic nursing, and the Continental Army especially, you have to remember, it was perpetually underfunded, understaffed, disorganized.
They didn't have a modern logistics corps.
They had an enormous logistical burden that they simply could not meet using only formally enlisted men whose job, was to train and fight.
And the reasons the women were there in the first place, they're just shockingly stark. It's all about survival.
It is. It wasn't always a choice of where to go. Often it was the only viable option to stay alive.
What were the main drivers, according to the sources?
Well, the documents outline several, and they really paint a picture of desperation. First, and most obviously, their husbands enlisted, often for long terms. That instantly cut off the family's main source of income.
So staying home alone, especially in a contested area, could literally mean starvation.
Starvation or worse, yes. Second, and this is key, these women provided essential labor that the army could not replace. If you look at an 18th century military budget, there's no line item for thousands of laundresses, cooks, and nurses.
Okay, so wait, why couldn't the army just hire civilian men to do those jobs? Or just assign soldiers to cook and wash?
They did try, sometimes. But the logistics were just overwhelming. Think about it. A soldier who's spending his day doing laundry or cooking over a fire is a soldier who isn't training, who isn't marching, who isn't fighting.
Right.
And beyond that, this was specialized labor. The sheer volume of the work. I mean, can you imagine trying to watch the uniforms for 1,000 men every week in a frozen river?
Just to prevent dysentery from wiping everyone out?
Exactly. That work was the prophylactic that kept the entire army functional. It required constant, dedicated effort.
And then there's that chilling calculus of safety. The sources mention that women were often safer with the army, which sounds counterintuitive.
It's a tragic paradox, isn't it? But yes, safety was found inside the chaos of the regiment. If you were left behind in a contested territory, you were subject to raids, supply confiscation by either side, violence.
So being with the army offered at least some measure of protection.
Some measure, yes. And the sources confirm that George Washington himself recognized this. He understood that soldiers fought better and were far less likely to desert when their families, their wives and children, were cared for within the camp structure.
So it was actually a calculated military decision to allow them to be there. It wasn't just tolerated.
It was a pragmatic decision.
Right.
So the core function of these women wasn't incidental. It wasn't decorative. It was about logistical survival for the entire force.
They were the operational backbone of daily camp life.
Absolutely. Their cooking was the fuel for the marches. Their laundry and nursing determined if sickness would decimate a regiment before they even saw the enemy. If this invisible army of women failed, the Continental Army literally ground to a halt.
Their labor was the fundamental prerequisite for any kind of combat efficiency.
And that's what makes what happened next so incredible.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because for generations, that essential contribution was just utterly erased and replaced with this really derogatory myth. We have to talk about how later historians actively worked to dismantle this reality.
Yeah, the traditional 19th century view is extraordinarily damning, and it reveals so much more about the historian's time than it does about the revolution.
Right.
For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, historians just dismissed these women as morally suspect nuisances. We have to look at figures like Benson J. Lossing, a very widely read historian from 1860.
What do they say?
He explicitly described camp followers as, and I'm quoting here, chiefly idlers, vagabonds, or worse, adding nothing to the efficiency of the army.
Wow, that just reeks of Victorian social expectations, doesn't it? They're being judged by this standard of, genteel stay-at-home domesticity that had no place in a military camp.
It's a complete projection. That moralizing tone, rooted in these later rigid social norms, it completely superseded the documented essential labor that was performed during the war.
So modern historical research, which is more concerned with function than moral purity, has had to basically dismantle this entire view, piece by piece.
Systematically dismantle it by looking at the actual military accounts and pension files. The sources lay out the contrast so clearly.
So the myth was that women were just tag-alongs, burdens.
Right, and the reality, proven by officer testimonials in these pension files, is that they provided desperately needed labor, nursing, washing, hauling supplies, maintaining basic sanitation.
And what about the myth that they all stayed safely behind the battle lines?
That is flat out contradicted by multiple sworn accounts. The reality is that many were in the line of fire. They were delivering water, ammunition, crucial supplies to soldiers who were actively engaged in combat. We're going to get into some specific, really painful testimonies that prove this later on.
And maybe the most damaging myth of all, that women weakened morale.
If anything, the opposite was true. Officers consistently noted that their presence stabilized camp life, it reduced desertion rates, and it improved the overall atmosphere.
Which allowed the male soldiers to focus entirely on their combat duty. It's a total reversal of the narrative.
This is a huge aha moment for historians. The myths persisted not because the women didn't contribute, but because the historical establishment actively chose to ignore the evidence. They preferred a simpler, more heroic, and frankly, more socially acceptable story.
One that excluded anyone who wasn't carrying a weapon.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the erasure itself. Why did these women nearly disappear from history for so long, even though these records eventually surfaced?
It was a convergence of several factors: bureaucratic, cultural, economic. The most fundamental reason is a technical one. They could not formally enlist.
Okay, so if you can't enlist, you're not on the main muster rolls of the regiment.
You're not. And that exclusion from the primary military bureaucracy delayed the recognition for generations.
So if they're not in the official rolls, they aren't entitled to the post-war benefits like land grants or federal pensions that usually bring a veteran service to light.
Precisely. Early federal pension laws were extremely strict. They often excluded anyone in a support role or anyone who wasn't formally listed as part of the establishment. This meant that the only way many of these women could get any compensation was to apply for state or local pensions.
Decades later,
when they were impoverished, elderly survivors who needed aid. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries when researchers began digging into those specific state and county pension files and court declarations, which required sworn testimony, that the detailed records of their service finally came out.
So the early historians just prioritized the generals and the battles, the big elite figures.
Absolutely. The focus was on high-level strategy, not the daily grind of survival. And culturally, Victorian morality played a huge role. It was socially acceptable, even scandalous, to portray women as being intimately involved in the gritty, violent, and often morally compromised life of a military camp.
It was just easier to pretend they were either absent or a burden. It maintained the illusion of a morally pure war effort.
Yes. And let's not forget the simple factor of literacy. Many of these camp followers were poor, often illiterate, or only semi-literate. They didn't leave many written records of their own.
The people who write history are usually not the people who lived in poverty on the frontier and marched alongside cannons.
That is the tragedy of missing voices. They had to rely on the surviving official records, the pension filings, the officer affidavits, to tell their story, often filtered through a court clerk. The emergence and careful reading of these records proves the vital conclusion. These women were indispensable. We only know their stories because necessity forced them to seek recognition years later.
Okay, so if the last segment was about the necessity of the collective, let's zoom in now on the unparalleled courage of one individual whose service was so stark, so undeniable, that it forced the military bureaucracy to recognize her. Let's talk about Margaret Corbin.
Margaret Corbin is the verifiable, documented example of direct combat participation. She didn't just support the fight, she literally stood in the path of it. She was born Margaret Cochrane around 1751, and her early life was defined by the dangers of the volatile frontier in what is now Franklin County, Pennsylvania.
And her childhood was marked by this incredible formative violence. Her parents were killed during a raid in the French and Indian War. I mean, that's a profound trauma that would shape anyone.
That loss and that early exposure to physical danger, it forged a distinct kind of resilience in her. She grew up accustomed to hard labor, to danger, to uncertainty. It prepared her uniquely for the grueling existence of Army life.
And she married John Corbin, an artilleryman,
Yeah.
and followed him when he enlisted.
Yes, she joined as a camp follower, supporting his company, just like thousands of other women did.
Which brings us to November 16, 1776, the disastrous Battle of Fort Washington. Tell us about the scene there. This was not a moment of American triumph.
Far from it. Fort Washington, which is on the northern tip of Manhattan, was a crushing, demoralizing American defeat. The garrison was just overwhelmed as British and Hessian forces launched this massive coordinated attack.
And the artillery units were critical.
They were critical for trying to slow down that ferocious enemy advance, but they were also dangerously exposed. They were taking frontal assault and flanking fire.
And this is where Margaret Corbin cemented her place in history. Not through logistical support, but through immediate physical combat.
When John Corbin was killed manning a cannon, it was a light field piece. Margaret did the extraordinary. She immediately stepped into his place.
And artillery work is not simple. It's a specific, dangerous skill set.
It requires a crew. It involves loading powder, swabbing the barrel, aiming, and she began loading and firing that gun alongside the remaining crew members, all under intense British and Hessian fire.
This wasn't just a fleeting moment of bravery. She kept firing until she herself was struck down.
She did, and the details of her injuries are just horrifying. They illustrate the sheer violent proximity to danger that she endured.
What happened to her?
The injuries were catastrophic and permanently disabling. She continued firing until she was struck by grapeshot, which is essentially a canister of large metal balls that sprays out of a cannon. She suffered a shattered left shoulder. Her arm was nearly torn from its socket, and she sustained serious wounds to her chest and jaw. She collapsed right there, next to the cannon, permanently wounded.
But unlike so many other women whose service just vanished into the chaos of war, Margaret's actions were undeniable. They were public, they were witnessed by officers who could attest to what happened.
They were, and that's why the military bureaucracy couldn't just ignore her. This led to official, permanent acknowledgement.
And this is the crucial legal detail, isn't it?
This is everything. In 1779, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not the still struggling Continental Congress, but Pennsylvania, granted her a lifelong pension. And this detail is monumental. It made her the first woman in American history to receive a military pension specifically for combat service.
So the paperwork itself had to confirm that her injuries were sustained in battle while performing a soldier's duty.
Exactly. It wasn't just aid. It was a combat pension. That official documentation is what matters most to historians. It's an acknowledgement that she was an invalid, a disabled veteran, in the same way any male soldier was. The system accepted her sacrifice.
And that acknowledgement followed her for the rest of her life.
It did. After the war, she was formally relocated and lived at West Point among other disabled veterans, accepting a partial ration for the rest of her life. The military community accepted her as one of their own who had bled for the cause. It was compensation, not charity.
So if we look at her story, what is the single greatest historical truth that Margaret Corbin's documentation proves about the role of women in the Revolution?
It shatters the myth of distance, the myth of separation from the fighting. Her story is definitive proof that women not only provided essential logistical support, but were physically present in the line of fire, capable of performing technical combat duties, and willing to pay the ultimate price.
She represents the absolute maximum risk taken by women in service to the Revolution, and it's all confirmed by official paper trails.
The power of the historical record here is that the official affidavits and the pension approvals, they speak across 2 centuries to confirm her courage under fire. That's why her story is so foundational. It's not a rumor. It's a fact that was paid for in grapeshot.
Okay, so we've established Margaret Corbin as the verified combat casualty, grounded in these specific legal and medical records. Now we have to move to a figure who is far more famous, but, well, far harder to pin down historically. Molly Pitcher.
Ah, yes, Molly Pitcher. This story really represents the blending of myth, memory, and reality.
Let's start with a real person, Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay.
She was unquestionably a real woman, married to an artilleryman, and she was present with the Army. But the name Molly Pitcher became less of a specific person and more of a collective symbol for the role itself.
Right, let's break down the name. Molly was a common nickname for Mary in the 18th century, but Pitcher, that was her job description.
Absolutely. Pitcher referred to the water vessels women carried, and they were vital in battle for 2 reasons. cooling the barrels of the cannons, which got incredibly hot and could misfire.
And hydrating the soldiers fighting in terrible conditions.
Exactly. So Molly Pitcher came to represent a real, essential, and repeated function, not just one celebrity figure.
And the famous action attributed to her took place at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey, June 28, 1778. What was the environment like?
That battle was fought in just brutal, almost unbearable summer heat. Some estimates say temperatures were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The conditions alone were enough to defeat men through heat stroke.
And the artillery units were right out in the open.
Exposed in open fields, working the guns at a relentless pace. Mary Ludwig Hayes was there, carrying water to the gun crews, and later credible accounts do confirm she stepped forward to assist or replace her husband, John, when he collapsed.
Likely from heat exhaustion, or maybe he was wounded.
Exactly. But this is where it gets tricky. How certain are we of the specifics? The accounts were written decades after the fact, and that's the core historical challenge here. The legend grew rapidly. We have to be meticulous about separating the hard facts from the later, more romantic traditions that filled in the blanks.
Okay, so based on the sources, what can we credibly accept about what happened at Monmouth?
The historical sources confirm several key points. One, women definitely carried water to artillery crews. That was common practice. Two, at least one woman assisted or replaced a fallen artilleryman in that battle. Three, and this is crucial, Mary Ludwig Hayes later received a Pennsylvania pension for her service, which confirms her presence and her contribution.
And Washington himself supposedly saw women near the guns.
Yes, George Washington is recorded to have observed women performing duties very near the guns, so the core of the story is real.
But the later traditions, they added all these flourishes that are less certain. They turned her into a kind of superhero figure.
They did. You see things like a formal battlefield promotion to sergeant by Washington. That's highly unlikely to be documented or true.
Right.
The idea of immediate Continental Army documentation of her service, or that a single named woman performed all the specialized artillery actions by herself, these are examples of that blurring process. The legend essentially simplified the repeated dangerous work of many women into one iconic figure.
But doesn't that make the Molly Pitcher legend more effective in a way? Even if it's less factual, it speaks to a broader truth.
Absolutely. Molly Pitcher matters because the role she represents was real, it was repeated, and it was indispensable. Her story confirmed for posterity that women were trusted with critical tasks directly under fire, that they were integral to artillery operations, and that they were close enough to battle to suffer the consequences.
The legend is a shortcut to remembering genuine, widely performed service.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so let's pivot from the celebrated legend to an invaluable primary source, Sarah Osborn. She is the anchor that grounds this entire discussion of camp followers in bureaucratic reality.
Sarah Osborn did not achieve legend status, which, paradoxically, makes her so much more valuable to historians. She left behind a clear, sworn pension testimony detailing years of continuous, essential service.
Her words are not interpretation filtered through folklore. They are legal evidence.
Exactly.
And her service was so constant, so essential, and it's detailed explicitly in her sworn record. What specific granular duties did she document?
Her testimony lets us reconstruct the daily grind. She confirmed constant labor, cooking over open fires, washing and mending uniforms for scores of soldiers, carrying water and provisions over rough terrain. She prepared food during the most active campaigns. She followed the army for years, accompanying her husband until he died, and then she just continued her service even after he was gone.
And the single detail that just completely crushes the myth of camp followers staying safely in the rear is her specific quote from that testimony. It's absolutely definitive, isn't it?
It is the definitive line in the historical record sworn before a court. Sarah Osborn stated, "I was with the army and did washing and cooking for the soldiers. I carried water to the men to drink and to make their coffee. I was in sight of the firing the whole time."
In sight of the firing the whole time. Wow. That single phrase. It proves they were not safely removed from danger. They were consistently within range of enemy musket and cannon fire.
Consistently. And her service extended to the decisive moment of the entire war, the Siege of Yorktown in 1781.
Can you set the scene for her presence there?
Osborn was present during the entire Siege of Yorktown, the campaign that effectively ended the war. She details the grueling logistical effort. crossing rivers with the troops, enduring extreme shortages, and continuing to feed and care for troops while the Continental and French artillery bombarded the British positions day and night.
So her relentless, quiet labor was sustaining the logistical engine of victory at the very moment it mattered most.
It absolutely was.
So, okay, we have Margaret Corbin, who received combat pay, and Molly Pitcher, who became a legend. Why does Sarah Osborn's testimony matter more than any of that folklore?
Because it was a sworn legal document. It was reviewed, it was accepted, and it was preserved in the federal archives. It requires no romantic interpretation. It confirms that thousands of women stayed with the Army for years, that their labor was not incidental but relied upon.
That they were present during the most critical major engagements.
Yes, and that their service, though quiet, was officially recognized through that difficult pension process.
It feels like the historical truth here is built on three pillars. Margaret Corbin proves women fought and were injured. Molly Pitcher shows how women were remembered through this enduring symbolic role. And Sarah Osborn proves, through legal record, how women worked and were documented right up to the end.
Precisely. And Osborn's testimony represents the thousands of unnamed, often illiterate women whose indispensable service only appears in these brief fragments of court records. Her voice is the collective voice of that logistical army.
The women we've discussed so far highlight critical logistical support and direct combat. But the reality, as uncovered by our sources, is that women participated across the entire spectrum of the conflict, from the physical battleground to the intellectual war of ideas, and even into high-stakes espionage.
We have to look first at the women who defied the military structure entirely by disguising themselves. Deborah Sampson is the most famous example of this.
Right.
She enlisted disguised as a man, serving as Robert Shirtliff for over a year, successfully blending right into the ranks.
Her commitment and the personal risks she took were just staggering. She marched, she fought, and when she was wounded, she took these extreme measures to maintain her secret.
She was wounded in a skirmish near Tarrytown, New York. And to avoid discovery during medical treatment, the sources reveal she removed a musket ball from her own thigh using a penknife and a sewing needle.
She performed surgery on herself.
She did, rather than risk a regimental surgeon discovering her true identity. That is an incredible act of endurance and caution just to keep serving.
And her gender was eventually discovered.
It was during a serious fever. But her service was later verified, and she too received a military pension, proving that even when it was forbidden, women actively sought and achieved sustained combat roles.
We also briefly mentioned Anna Maria Lane, who reinforces that women were close enough to danger to get wounded.
Yes, Anna Maria Lane followed her husband through the entire war and was wounded at the Battle of Germantown. Like Corbin, she later received a pension from the state of Virginia for her service and her injuries. These verified accounts just keep confirming that women were not only present, but suffered serious physical wounds.
They were participants, not observers.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving far beyond the musket and the cannon, we have to turn to the War of Ideas, which was championed by Phillis Wheatley. And at Conflict About Liberty, her poetry served as this crucial intellectual weapon.
Wheatley, an enslaved African-American poet, was fighting the intellectual and moral battle. Her works challenged the inherent glaring contradictions of the revolution.
How could these men be fighting for freedom while holding hundreds of thousands of others in bondage?
That was the question she forced people to confront. Her poetry was recognized internationally, and she specifically addressed revolutionary leaders like George Washington, who praised her work.
Can you tell me more about how her poetry really acted as a fighting tool in that era?
Her poem, To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth, written in 1772, is a phenomenal example. She draws a direct connection between her own experience of being kidnapped from Africa and the Patriots' fight against British oppression. She basically argues that those who cry for liberty while denying it to others cannot truly understand its value.
So her work forced readers, including the leaders of the revolution, to confront the moral hypocrisy that was right at the heart of their movement.
It's a potent reminder that this revolution wasn't just tactical maneuvers. It was a profound philosophical and moral battle over the very definition of freedom.
And then in stark contrast to that intellectual battlefield, you have someone like Nancy Hart, who embodied the brutal reality of frontier resistance in the South.
Nancy Hart is often cited as this larger-than-life figure, and the sources do confirm her intense confrontation with Loyalist forces in Georgia.
What was she known for?
She was renowned for gathering intelligence and actively aiding Patriot efforts in a region where the war wasn't about formal battles. It was brutal, neighbor against neighbor skirmishes. Her story reflects the violent, irregular nature of warfare in the South, where every civilian was forced to choose a side and often fight for their own survival.
Let's shift focus now to resistance in occupied territory. This is where the danger was maybe even greater because it was secretive and you were surrounded by the enemy. Elizabeth Burgin in British-occupied New York City is a stunning example of this.
Occupied New York was a dangerous, heavily policed, and starving place for patriots. And Burgin, a civilian woman, used deception and disguise to approach the notorious British prison ships anchored in the harbor.
These are the floating death traps, right?
Exactly. Places where American prisoners died daily from starvation, disease, and abuse.
So this sounds like high-stakes, real-world espionage. How did she actually help them escape?
She was incredibly methodical and brave. She would smuggle food, intelligence, and tools to the prisoners. The sources indicate she used small boats and deception to get close to the ships, helping dozens of American sailors and soldiers escape the horrors of the Jersey and other prison hulks. She was actively organizing an underground railroad out of the most dangerous place in the city.
And the British response confirms just how successful she was.
Precisely. When the British authorities discovered her activities, they were furious. They confiscated all her property and issued warrants for her arrest, which forced her to flee the city and seek protection with the Continental Army. That official, documented retaliation is the strongest possible evidence of her impact.
It highlights that this resistance was happening everywhere. In harbors, in prisons, on city streets, not just on a battlefield.
This broad scope of participation, fighting, working, writing, resisting, enduring wounds, it just shows that these women were not anomalies. They were part of the very core fabric of the revolution, fighting their battles wherever they stood.
But our sources also demand we confront the ultimate, darkest cost of this civilian resistance, which was lethal punishment.
We have to. The risks taken by women like Burgin were real, and they were not immune from execution.
And these weren't necessarily formal, high-profile trials, were they?
No. In occupied cities and volatile frontier regions, British and Loyalist authorities sometimes executed women accused of aiding the rebellion, spying, carrying intelligence, assisting escapes. These executions often happened as immediate reprisals, carried out quickly to discourage more resistance, without the lengthy procedure of a formal court-martial.
So the records are sparse.
Very sparse. Often just local accounts or post-war testimonies, because civilian resistance was often punished quietly and informally.
It's tragic, isn't it? The scarcity of names doesn't mean these acts didn't happen. It just means the 18th century official paperwork, which was focused on military movements, didn't care to document civilian casualties in detail.
And finally, you have the case of Jane McCrae in 1777. She's a stark cautionary tale. While she wasn't formally executed by the British, her death at the hands of native allies of the British became this hugely powerful patriot propaganda symbol.
So her death illustrates how any civilian woman could become a lethal casualty even when they weren't an active combatant.
Simply by being caught in the crossfire or targeted during British-aligned operations. It's a powerful, sobering reminder that the war reached every corner of society, and the cost of participation, whether through labor, espionage, or fighting, was constant and absolute.
So to summarize the synthesis of all these records.
The term camp followers has to be recognized as diminishing the true, comprehensive role these women played. They were demonstrably the essential logistical backbone of the Continental Army. They performed necessary, unrelenting labor that allowed the war effort to be sustained for years. They made victory possible.
Their courage wasn't theoretical. It was proven at Fort Washington by Margaret Corbin, whose severe wounds led to the first combat pension for a woman.
It was memorialized in the enduring figure of Molly Pitcher, who represented that indispensable repeated role of women under fire at Monmouth.
And most importantly, it was confirmed and documented by Sarah Osborn, whose sworn testimony placed women in sight of the firing at Yorktown.
Together, their stories reveal a broader truth. The revolution wasn't a brief moment of isolated masculine heroism. It was a long, grinding war, a fabric woven together by ordinary people, men and women enduring extraordinary hardship and constant risk to keep the army functional.
So remembering the women of the Revolutionary War isn't about rewriting history. It's about completing it. It's about filling in the enormous gaps left by early historians who were obsessed with battles and generals.
And the official records, the court affidavits, the pension files, the British confiscation orders, they are the strongest, most undeniable evidence we have.
Which leads to a final question for you, the listener.
If the stories of Margaret Corbin, Mary Ludwig Hayes, and Sarah Osborn were almost lost hidden in obscure pension files and local court testimonies filed decades later, what other completed stories still await discovery in the hidden corners of history?
What other state, county, or local records are just sitting unread right now that could fundamentally change our understanding of how our nation was truly built?
It's an ongoing project for all of us to seek out those hidden documents.
It is. And if you're curious to explore this legacy further, resources like the Military Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery serve as a living bridge, honoring the service of women from 1776 right up to the present day. We encourage you to seek out those primary sources yourself and complete the history.